Great. So without further ado, hello everyone. I am pleased to have Ben Eunson on the other side of this conversation. He's in Brooklyn, New York City at the moment. I am here in Mexico City. It is a beautiful autumn day down here. And Ben Eunson is a young guitar player who's originally from Australia, but he has a fantastic sound. In many ways, I think he's redefining the sound of the electric guitar, and he's just absolutely fantastic. He's been very kind to give us a few minutes of his time, and we're going to talk about a few things, mainly his new record called Ace, but also maybe a bit of gear, his influences, what life is like as a musician in New York City, and so on. So thanks so much again, Ben, for being here in this interview. How are you doing over there in Brooklyn?
I'm doing great, Ricardo. Thank you for having me. Life is good. I have been playing music a lot, which is the thing that I have gotten to do with my life, and I'm loving every bit of it. I just put my new record out, as you mentioned, Ace, which I'm really proud of, and we put a lot of work into. And I just got back from Brazil, actually, doing a short tour with the great drummer Terry Carrington, and that was a blast, And I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Well, I think it's fantastic. I would like to let whomever's listening and watching this video, to let them know what the context of the conversation is. But I stumbled upon your music first and foremost through Instagram. I was blown away by your skills first off, and then I realized that you actually put on tutorials, you give lessons, and you've got a whole bunch of material online and some very cool live videos as well. So I said, well, I better contact this man at some point. He's a brilliant player, and he seems rather accessible. So, and I was very surprised that he actually replied to my to my email. So that is absolutely fantastic. I would like to know a little bit about yourself, if you could. Tell me a bit, how you came from Australia and landed in the US, maybe a bit about your studies in music and how you ended up being a professional music player.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a great question. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, which is a really beautiful place. And I began to play music there as a child, firstly the piano.
All right.
And then the violin, but that didn't last too long. It wasn't for me. I used to turn the violin sideways and pretend it was a guitar eventually. So I think that signified to my parents that I probably wanted to play guitar. So my dad had an old acoustic that was up in the attic of our house. Mm-hmm. And I kept asking him to please get the acoustic. And, I started playing it, and essentially teaching myself. And I was drawn to, a lot of different styles of guitar playing, but the first notable guitarist that I heard that I really liked was George Benson.
Right.
Great jazz guitarist, George Benson, whose albums happened to be in my parents' record collection. Mm-hmm. And, but also a wide range of other guitarists like Andy Summers from The Police and Jeff Beck initially, and then eventually I discovered Pat Metheny, and that was sort of absolutely the direction that I wanted to go in, a jazz-related direction, after I heard Pat. And from there on, I sort of followed that path of being an aspiring jazz musician, I guess you'd say, through my teenage years. Mm-hmm. And all the while planning how I could possibly get to the United States to be a musician there, because it was just something I'd noticed that the majority of music that I loved came from the United States, specifically New York or Los Angeles,
Right.
And as it happened, I had the good fortune of being able to go to school briefly when I was 21 in Boston. And I got a scholarship to go to school in Boston. And while I was there, I started getting called to play gigs down in New York City. And from there, it began to grow. So, I left Australia at 21, which is a while ago now. I'm 29 now. And it sort of grew from there, and I've had a fantastic time getting to play music here in New York over the last 8 years, and it's been great.
Well, I can imagine. Thank you so much for that brief introduction. I think I have quite a few points to make, because I couldn't help myself when you were saying about, mentioning Pat Metheny and George Benson. I remember I grew up mostly with rock and roll and with blues and with genres which were heavily based on blues. But I did listen to a few jazz guitar players at some point, and to me that they probably were so far up there, or were so incredibly talented, that I felt that I still had to learn a lot to even be able to enjoy them properly. So I think that was quite impressive for me as a young music player, because something that's funny, and we mentioned before recording this interview, was that we are about the same age, and we seem to have several influences in common. So I thought that was quite funny. That is very cool. You mentioned Jeff Beck as well, and I'm getting a bit. I'm fast forwarding a bit because we'll talk about your album eventually. But one of the tracks in your new album, Ace, is a cover of Jeff Beck. I think since we've ended as lovers. I think that's the title. Yeah,
that's right.
And your execution is fantastic. I've only heard a few people covering that particular song, and you do it great honor.
Oh, thank you very much, Ricardo. I really appreciate that. It was doing a remake, if you will, or my version of that piece of music was something that I actually lost a lot of sleep over. I wanted to make sure that if I were to record a version of a piece of music with such a great legacy, I needed to sort of do it justice in some way and come up with my own take on it. Because Jeff Beck's version is the definitive version of that song. In a way, there's almost no need for anyone to record another version of it. It was the suggestion of my co-producer, Michael Perez Cisneros, who he said to me, "Why don't you just try a version of it? Why don't you, do your take on a classic?" And I thought, well, you know what? Why don't I try it? I'm always one to be open to trying things in the studio.
Right.
We did a couple of versions of it that just didn't work for me. I started off with sort of a solo acoustic guitar version, and it was fine, but I didn't like it that much. And then we did another version with the bass player and the drummer on the record, and that was okay. But then we did a third version, which is the one on the album, and we sort of got it in one take. I sort of stopped caring. I was going in with too many preconceived notions of what a remake of that song should be. And in the end, I just went in the studio and turned the amps up really loud and thought, look, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to play it as I would. And it sort of worked. So that's the story behind it.
Well, it's actually that precisely was something which I really appreciated, because it is your take on a classic. When I was listening to it, and I gave it quite a few listens in the car and at home, and I got to understand that you weren't trying to imitate him, that you were trying to actually pay him some sort of a tribute in your own terms. And I really liked that. I thought that was very honest.
So, great. I'm glad that was sort of communicated through the music. I'm glad that you picked up on it, because I think that, jazz being something with a great history, but the guitar also having its own remarkable history. There's such a tremendous lineage now of great guitar players that I wouldn't ever want to do a tribute just for a tribute's sake. I sort of thought, man, this is such an iconic piece of music that resonated with me when I was growing up, first listening to the guitar. What if I did my version of it? And the album Ace as well is sort of a reflection for me. I'm 29. The album served in my mind as a bit of a reflection on my life in music so far. I managed to go in a lot of different musical directions on the album, and I think that's a reflection of what I've gotten to do musically in my life. And recording a version of a Jeff Beck song was kind of included in that as well for me personally. So I'm really glad to hear that you felt that way listening to it.
Absolutely. So, and I'm being totally honest. I might be biased because I love the album. So, so that the listener and the audience should know that beforehand.
I appreciate it.
That being said, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So, coming back to you being in the States, being a young guy, starting to play some gigs and discovering that music could be a professional path for you. How were those first years? Because I understand that you do have a first album, which came out before this one, and you've pretty much built your career in the US as a musician. I can also imagine the pressure of being within the jazz realm, which is something, and particularly being a genre where you have a lot of instrumental players. I guess there is a pressure to be the best or to really stand out through skill, which I think you've managed to do quite well. But was it ever was there ever pressure, or what did you ever have doubts during this period? Growing up, becoming a professional musician, and being in the States.
Yeah, that's a great question. Moving to the United States at age 21 was something that, well, before I did it, before I made the move, I thought, yeah, I'm going to do it. It's going to be easy, And then upon making the move, I realized that it was perhaps going to be a little more difficult than I anticipated, Right. But that's all right. I think that I felt as though I had nothing to lose in a way, because I moved to the United States with this sort of mentality of just having as good a work ethic as I could have, just making sure that I was constantly working on my playing, constantly playing with as many people as I could, and attempting to get my name, if you will, out there as much as possible. And it has definitely been an overwhelming task, especially when I was in my earliest days, but I sort of think I had this mentality of feeling as though I had nothing to lose, and just constantly kept pushing as a result. And I think, especially in a great music scene like New York has, or like New York is rather, one thing leads to another, and you meet more and more people, and slowly but surely your reputation builds if you can deliver.
Right.
If you've done the work.
Good point.
So I think there's a lot to be said for that. If you know that you've done the work in a certain area and you have patience within yourself, I think that you can get to exactly where you want to be, especially in something like music, which is a bit of a mysterious path in life. It's hard to know what the right way is to be successful in music. So I think that persistence and dedication and focus can get you really far.
Thank you so much for that answer, and I think that really shows, not only in your playing and through where you are at this point in time, but I like the fact that it applies to many areas. I think whatever you do professionally, or even if it's just a hobby, if you do, I like the fact that you said if you have sufficient patience, and having nothing to lose also makes you lose a lot of fear, because you the only direction which you can go is just forward. So that keeps you pushing forward. I really like that. I appreciated that analogy.
Oh, good. Yeah. I think especially also, when you and transplant yourself within the United States, for example, as I did do when I was quite young, you feel a sense of urgency, whatever way you can. That's how I felt anyway. I certainly felt a sense of urgency that, well, I've moved 15,000 kilometers across the world.
Right.
I have to make this work.
Sure. And
it was tough.
And you are from Australia, so in a sense, you are, well, one of the most, I wouldn't say isolated countries, but you certainly are a pretty big continent and a pretty, a country within its own ranges.
Yeah.
So I guess once you move out, I guess there's a certain pressure or a certain feeling that you have to make that decision work. Right?
It doesn't hit me until I step on a plane back to Australia and I look at the map, you know, and I see exactly from New York to Australia down in the bottom of the earth on the map, and I think, wow, that's pretty far.
Yeah, that's got to be a pretty long flight.
It is, but you know,
great.
at the same time, it's I've had not to sound as though that has been too much of a struggle. It's and like I said earlier, if you have the right attitude and within yourself a really strong work ethic and desire to get to where you want to be, I really do think that anything's possible. It's just a matter of patience and continuing to make sure that you work and be happy within yourself.
Great. Well, that's a brilliant answer, I think. I'd like to focus on your current music, because I have seen quite a few videos of you playing with some fantastic musicians a couple of years ago, and I would only recommend people to listen to those tracks and to see your performance. I saw you were playing with a hollow body guitar. I couldn't tell if it was a Collings or if it was a Gibson or a 335, something of that kind, but it was a lovely guitar. Was it a Collings?
It was. In fact, I for some time played Ibanez guitars. It was an early 80s AS50 made by Ibanez, and I really loved those instruments, and I still have a couple of them.
Right.
I stopped playing them in about 2014, purely for the fact that I started getting calls for such a wide variety of different musical styles here in New York City that I needed one guitar that I could take on the subway to cover almost anything that I might need to do. And there's no one guitar that will ever truly have that capability, but the closest I got to it was the Fender Stratocaster, which really, in a lot of ways, could cover everything. And it was around that time 5 years ago that I switched to this blue guitar, which I'm sort of known for now.
Great. So this is absolutely great. I actually wanted to focus on this for some time, but what I wanted to say is that your new record is quite appealing in many ways, and to me it was attractive due to the fact that you show a different approach both to jazz and to music in general. There are quite a few bits and pieces from other genres or other influences that I could say, oh well, this reminds me a bit of Steely Dan. Is that a bit of Larry Carlton, or is that this sounds a bit like Jeff Beck? Oh, is that a bit of Eric Johnson perhaps in there, or is that so? To me, it was fantastic because I said this is mostly jazz, but it's also very rock and roll in some ways. It's a bit heavier on a few tracks, and it's very. I don't know, it's very exciting in many ways. I think you showed a very different side of your music, and I still don't know all of your music that well, but to me it was quite surprising to see this, slightly younger side and more traditional approach to jazz, and you covering some new terrain on this new album. So that was very exciting to me, and to see that you had changed to another guitar, which was the Fender Stratocaster, which you just showed very only briefly. Yeah, so that was very exciting for me to see.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. I really appreciate you saying that, Ricardo. I think that for me, I just wanted to go in another direction for this album, and a few people, well, actually, a lot of people noted to me that it wasn't what they were expecting from me, and I take that as a really big compliment.
Yeah,
because I think that. If you begin to be predictable, then that's a precarious place to be as an artist.
Right.
I think that if people were expecting something and they got exactly what they were expecting, well, that's fine. But for me, it's more exciting for people to say, "Wow, that wasn't what I was expecting."
Right. Yeah.
And I felt as though of all the musical worlds that I have been fortunate enough to inhabit over the last, my entire 20s really, which has mostly been in New York, I wanted to reflect a bit of all of those worlds that I've managed to inhabit, and represent it on this record.
Can we talk briefly about your guitar? Because I knew you have it there, and it's a great opportunity to cover that. You don't see too many jazz guitar players playing Stratocasters these days, and also you seem to have relatively high output pickups. So you have a punchy sound as well. Whenever you want that to be that way. So I'm interested in seeing why you chose that particular instrument, and why can it deliver such a broad range of sounds. Why was that appealing for you?
That's a really good question. The initial idea behind the Strat, it was purely to accommodate a broad range of musical styles that I was getting called for. That I on usable for jazz. Could be used in jazz in a more traditional sense, but it also had a broad range of other tonal capabilities which worked for other types of music too. So initially it was just out of necessity, and also I needed it to be all in one just to get on the subway, because the New York subway is a bit of a nightmare sometimes, but it's how everyone gets around. So from there on, I just sort of fell in love with the sound of the instrument and thought, well, rather than it being a purely utilitarian idea of, it's a guitar that does everything, I thought, well, aside from that, I just love the sound of it. So I thought, when you play an instrument that you really love the sound of, it ends up being very inspiring in terms of your own outlook on music. So the sound of the instrument itself sort of inspired me to write and arrange the music that ended up on my album Ace. The Strat is the main instrument heard throughout the record. And I generally tend to go for a brighter tone, which you mentioned a moment ago. I really like the clarity and the sort of, the brightness that you can get from the Stratocaster pickups. I feel as though, for me, who doesn't, for any guitarist listening, I don't pick every note that I play. I sort of use a bit of a legato approach. That really depends upon the left hand doing most of the work. And I feel as though having a sort of brighter sound, as provided by the Stratocaster, you can sort of hear that articulation with my left hand with a lot of clarity, and I really like that.
And I also thought that you equalized the guitar quite well, that you use it in a very clever manner, because I could hear you using perhaps different pickups or different sounds. And you mentioned that the Stratocaster can be very bright in a good way, but sometimes unnecessarily bright. And I think you tamed it quite well. I think you do a great job equalizing the actual sound of the guitar. So that's very cool. And especially with high output pickups, which would be perhaps more oriented towards rock and roll, or like I said, at some points I said, well, this reminds me a bit of Eric Johnson, but then it's jazzy. Well, it's brilliant. I didn't know how to feel about it. I was like, this is kind of mind blowing.
Oh man, I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, I really one of the ideas behind the sound that I used was also that I utilized sort of natural overdrive coming from the amps that I was using on the record, and the amps that I used, usually recording in stereo. Two amplifiers were custom-built amplifiers built by my co-producer and recording engineer, Michael Perez Cisneros.
No kidding.
And he custom-built these amps at his studio, and I just loved the way they sounded. I felt as though they really represented my playing better than any other amplifier I had used. And when all is said and done, I'll still sound like myself through any amplifier, but the way that these amps sounded was just, I fell in love with it, And from there on, Michael helping me co-produce the record, we both worked on tweaking the guitar tones and making sure there was enough natural overdrive coming from the amps that the guitar sound was big, but not too much natural overdrive so as to distract from the music, not too much of a dirty sound.
That is something that I did appreciate quite a lot. The overall mix is very balanced. You can listen to the saxophone player, to the guitar player. You can listen to the drums. The drum sound is beautiful all along the record. The bass player as well. So I thought it was very, very well mixed. Although you are the main the main artist driving the music along the record, you generally see a very fair balance between everyone. So was that something that you wanted to emphasize carefully, or?
Well, yeah, and I'm really glad that came across, because again, this was probably more than anything a collaborative process between myself and, again, my co-producer Michael Perez Cisneros. He co-produced the album, engineered it, mixed it, and mastered it, and that I worked very closely with him on that, and we did as many as 30 mixes of each song. So and with great credit to his immense patience.
That is crazy. 30 mixes of each song.
Song, and there's 10 songs, so there are 10 songs. So again, great credit to his patience with me in wanting to get it right. It was never something that ended up in a heated argument. It was just a constant dialogue between he and I, trying to make it sound right. And he really is a tremendously skilled and gifted person to work with. His credits speak for themselves with Kurt Rosenwinkel, Esperanza Spalding, Gerd Hexelman, and many more. And working with him has been fantastic, and it won't be the last time we work together, because the sounds he got were exactly as I envisioned.
That is great. And also, I would like to have a brief parenthesis here and mention to the audience that you have done some amazing work, also collaborating with artists of the likes of John Legend, and I've even read Queen Latifah, which was quite surprising. And I think that speaks for your work and the collaborations you do. I would like to pose you the typical desert island question.
Yeah.
So because I'd like to also to take the audience, or to get them a bit closer to jazz, and to talk about jazz in a more general way. If you were on a desert island, say you had to pick 3, 5, I don't know, you pick the number, but a few, a bunch of records that you couldn't live without, or that you would definitely recommend, which do you think would be your favorite?
Well, it's always very tough to narrow these things down.
I know it's a very tough question,
but thinking about it just now, I would say that there is an album called Watercolors by Pat Metheny from 1977.
Right.
Which was really important for me in terms of, its influence on the course of my life, wonderful writing and melodic improvisation, which really had a huge impact on me. What else?
I know it's a terribly difficult question, but I'll leave it to you. You can go as broad as you like. They don't necessarily have to be jazz records. But I was very curious to see which albums you appreciated most, and which were some of your main influences, perhaps.
I would say I could definitely give you some more. I would say that there's an album called Mr. Gone by Weather Report from 1978, which is sort of arguably the most debated Weather Report album, with Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, Jaco Pastorius, and several drummers actually. And some people love it, some people hate it. I love it because it was so daring, and I think that there's something about music that is very daring, and leaves people maybe a little divided even as to whether they love it or hate it. There's something I like about that.
Sure.
So that album would be one. I would be remiss to not acknowledge that Steely Dan had a huge impact on my life. I could almost pick any one of their albums, but I'd probably say Gaucho by Steely Dan from 1980. John Coltrane had a big impact on my life. the great jazz saxophone player John Coltrane. And I would say that, well, of all of his albums, it's hard to pick one, but there's an album called Coltrane's Sound, which had a big impact on me. Fantastic. And then something that is maybe a little, less predictable, but Keith Jarrett, the great pianist Keith Jarrett, is one of my biggest influences, I would say. And he had an album called Spirits in 1985, I think it came out, and it's all him just in his home studio on me. So I could also go on. I could give you 20 albums.
No worries. I think that's a fair mix. I'll definitely post links to these albums on the article. We'll write an article about this interview for anyone who's interested in listening to these artists, which I think is great. I know I mentioned before the interview that we'd talk for some 15 minutes or so, but this is a very unique opportunity. So forgive me if I'm
no problem.
Going slightly beyond that. But I would also like to ask you if there are any contemporary artists or even some contemporary guitar players in other genres, even whose music you like or whom you might be excited about. Is there anything that you find particularly exciting?
Yeah, I am constantly blown away by how many great musicians there are in the world these days. The internet has connected us in a way that was previously not possible. Mm-hmm. And I'm sort of overwhelmed by the amount of great musicians. It's almost hard for me to pick contemporaries because there are quite a few of them. Mm-hmm. But
was there anything that you've been listening to recently that's caught your attention?
I've been listening, honestly, recently I've been listening to mostly classical music, so I sort of interesting. I may not be the best person to ask, but I know I'm going to be kicking myself when we finish talking that there were people that I didn't mention. But I've noticed the world over that there are a number of fantastic guitar players, especially, that I'm noticing come up. And I can't think of names right now, but
oh, no worries. I was just curious to see whether you had a particular artist and on top of mind these days, but also classical music is something very interesting. I was very intrigued by how me being a bedroom guitar player, and I always play guitar, but in a very not in a very what's the word for this in English, but I wasn't as since I was interested in a wide variety of things, I guess I wasn't as persistent with practicing, and I was not as I'm missing the words for this, but I guess I could have tried harder on practicing every day and going beyond my current skills. But I was very impressed to see how you can read sheet music and how you write music in such a complex way. And to me, as a bedroom guitarist, I read tabs and I just, I can play a few chords and do covers, but to me, that's beyond any, that's almost superhuman. So that's something very interesting. How was the writing process of your latest album? Was it something very, very daring? Was it something you had to struggle with, or is it second nature for you? Or?
It was. I think I took some chances with the writing on the album because I've been involved with a wide variety of types of music, but I think when all is said and done, I'm probably best known for playing jazz in one form or another. So the chances that I took were implementing elements of sort of, I guess you'd say, rock, in a sense, implementing elements of other styles of music which would enable me to maybe turn the volume up a little bit and explore rhythmic elements that were not specifically coming out of jazz necessarily, but still using my sort of improvisational guitar style on top of those rhythmic elements or on top of the harmony that was being used and stuff like that. And I took a bit of a chance with that, you know. I knew that there were going to be people who would not necessarily warm to it immediately coming from a jazz perspective, but at the end of the day, I think that it's really important to stay true to yourself and to try not to repeat music that has already been recorded, you know. I felt as though there is so much fantastic straight ahead jazz in existence right now, and a lot of sort of individual statements that have been made, and I felt as though, well, I'd like to make an individual statement myself, and that's always a risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking, you know. I don't regret it.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. So what is ahead of you these days? What are the next steps in your career, or are you planning on playing? Well, you mentioned you went abroad, but do you have some gigs internationally, or what are the next steps that you'll take after the record?
That is a great question. So in 2020, what I'm doing is I'm going to line up some tour dates for the record. The music industry is an interesting industry these days, so it doesn't always line up perfectly that you can set up a tour immediately after the release of the record. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
Right.
But we will be working that out for 2020. And primarily just the United States right now, but with a bit of luck, we'll be able to go internationally a little bit as well. So I'll keep you posted about that. But for now, we'll be doing some dates on the East Coast and the West Coast in the United States, and with a bit of luck, branching out from there.
Great. Well, I look forward to that, and hopefully you can come down to Mexico at some point. I think
I'd love to.
There's a fair number of people who would love to see you down here, and there's an interesting jazz scene as well, which you might appreciate. So that is something very cool. I'll definitely look forward to that tour.
I would love to, yeah.
Ben, well, you've been more than kind to lend us a bit of your time. Is there anything that you would like to emphasize, or anything that you would like to convey for a Mexican audience or a Spanish-speaking audience, related maybe to your work, to jazz, or to music in general?
So I would say that some of the greatest support for my music has come from people in South America, you know, and from countries in South America, you know, people in Mexico, especially. I've noticed a lot of support for my music, and I really must convey how much I appreciate that. You know, without people who supported my music and listened to it, well, I wouldn't get to do this. I literally wouldn't. And it would, as a result, be a dream of mine to come to Mexico and play. So I'm working on it.
Fantastic. That is great.
So that would be what I'd say. I just have to say thank you. I know there are a lot of people in Mexico who support my music and have sent me emails and messages showing that support, and without people supporting the music, there would be no music. So all I can say is thank you, and I'll be there as soon as I can.
That is great. Thank you so much for that comment. I think a lot of people will be very excited to see you down here.
I'd love it.
Ben, I don't want to keep any more of your time. You've been more than generous. I think we have quite a few excellent recommendations for anyone who wants to go into jazz. And also, you know, the main recommendation is that you go out there and buy Ben's album, and that you give it a listen. It's also on Spotify, right, and pretty much any streaming platform.
Yeah.
So that's an invitation for that. Hopefully you can come down here soon enough. And thanks so much again, Ben. All the best up over there to Brooklyn, and I'll keep you posted. Hopefully we can either jam a little bit, or I can help you out with maybe with some singing, because I don't think I'll be up to the task in the guitar. But I certainly look forward to that. We'll be clapping in the audience. So.
No problem. Well, however you like to support the music, it's always appreciated, Ricardo. No worries.
Fantastic. Well, I wish you a great day over there, Ben. And I'll say goodbye for the moment, and goodbye to all of the audience. Until the next time, this has been Ricardo Salas, and this is Ben Eunson, directly from Brooklyn. So until the next time.